The following content is provided by MIT OpenCourseware under a Creative Commons license. Additional information about our license and MIT OpenCourseware in general is available at ocw.mit.edu.
And we have a stellar cast tonight, starting with Stephen Moga, who's a doctoral student here in City Design and Development at MIT, followed by Will Stacy, a young photographer from New York, and wrapping up will be our beloved chairman, Larry Vail, who will be reflecting on both the presentations that Will and Steve give, as well as to make some observations of his own about photography and city planning and rebuilding New Orleans. I'll introduce each of both Steve and Will just before their presentation. Steve is going to go first. Steve has, in talking to both of them, I came to realize that in a way, each of them in his own way has been preparing to photograph New Orleans at this particular point in time for quite a while now. And they didn't know it until they arrived in New Orleans after the hurricane. Steve came to us this year as a first-year doctoral student following an undergraduate degree in political science from Carleton College in Minnesota and a master's degree in city planning from UCLA, but also after 5 years experience working in low-income African-American communities on affordable housing issues, and then another 5 years working on issues of historic preservation. And I think that this background will come clear to you as he presents his photographs. Steve.
Thank you, Ann. So as Ann mentioned, I'm going to show photos from 2 recent visits to New Orleans in January and March of this year. I'm a first-year PhD student in the CDD group, and my interest is in planning history. And prior to MIT, I had some experience with photography, but usually on the other end of the camera, I guess you could say, working with a nonprofit project called the Neighborhoods Project of Los Angeles. So for me, taking photos and thinking about places, neighborhoods, urban planning is connected. I've been a student of the city of New Orleans and its history for 13 years. And recently, New Orleans has come to the national attention. But few people outside of the city have much non-tourist experience with it. There's many misconceptions about this place. And there's a debate about rebuilding in this context. Rather than establish public safety first, then coordinate return of residents, instead, in the public debates, neighborhoods have been given a test to prove their future viability based on population. Yet these decisions are highly constrained and neighborhood conditions vary tremendously. New Orleans is a city of neighborhoods like the French Quarter, the Lower Ninth, Ferret, Treme, Lakeview, Uptown. And today I'm going to talk about 2 neighborhoods that I visited on these trips to New Orleans recently. Broadmoor, which is here. Here's the river, Mississippi River. The lake is at the top, north is at the top. The French Quarter is here. The Central Business District is here. This is Broadmoor. And Holy Cross, which is part of the Lower Ninth. In thinking about photographing New Orleans, I asked myself the question, what does New Orleans look like? What did it look like before and after the flood? And what are our impressions of the place and what happened there? One of the challenges in photographing New Orleans is that it was physically dilapidated and decayed before the flood. New Orleans has an unfamiliar architecture to most Americans. And it was common to see peeling paint or scruffy landscaping, sagging porches around the neighborhoods of New Orleans. Often on previous visits, I would see vacant lots, abandoned houses, potholes. New Orleans was a city with significant social and economic problems. But it had unusual resources too, a strong sense of civic pride, a long tradition of mixed-race families, and a well-deserved reputation as a cultural meeting ground, a place of family ties and rootedness, and of particular interest to me, a historic built environment. Today, when you visit New Orleans, the thing that you see is the absence of people in the streets. Some of the other symbols that you might see are blue tarps on roofs from wind damage from the hurricane. But you're unlikely to see the interior destruction in most areas if you don't go inside the homes. You may only see piles of debris at the street side. And everywhere you go, you see signs. Signs of civic pride, homemade signs, political signs, signs for demolishing homes, people who will gut the interior of your house for you, people looking for work. So I'm going to talk about two neighborhoods today. The first one is Holy Cross. And Holy Cross is a neighborhood in the lower 9th Ward, a neighborhood which is probably at least familiar in name to most Americans now. The lower 9th Ward is downriver from the French Quarter, and it's separated from the rest of the city from by the Industrial Canal. This is a photo of the Industrial Canal. I was hesitant to go to the lower 9th the first time in January because I was unsure of what I would see, but I knew it would be difficult. And when I got there, it was a kind of visual overload, trying to take everything in at once. The flooding in the lower 9th Ward was caused by a catastrophic break in the Industrial Canal. And a wall of water washed over the neighborhood, lifting houses off of their foundations. When I visited in January, there were scenes of devastation like this one all around on every side. And it was the scale that impressed me more than anything else. I returned in March and I had different ideas in mind, but again I was unsure of what I would see. One of the things I had in mind is that March is Shotgun House in New Orleans, a long tradition of the Preservation Resource Center. And I heard that a tour was going to be offered in the Holy Cross neighborhood, part of the lower 9th Ward. So I decided to go. Holy Cross is part of the lower 9th, but it's on the riverside. And it's part of the story of what's happening in the lower 9th Ward. Before I visited there, I had heard that houses were wiped out in Hurricane Betsy, that the area should not be rebuilt. And I knew that a political conflict was underway about demolition and clearing of the houses there. I had witnessed the scenes of utter devastation in other parts of the lower 9th Ward. And then I learned that Holy Cross was a historic district. I wondered, how could a place destroyed by flooding in 1965 be an historic district? And why did people tend to talk about poor black historic neighborhoods one way and middle class and white wealthy historic neighborhoods using another language? How could a place with houses older than the Industrial Canal be slated for complete demolition? Instead of look and leave, a slogan used by the military to keep people out, this tour was called Look and Believe. This is Gina Jones. I talked to Gina in Holy Cross. City services have not been reestablished there. The city has stated that the area is not safe. And many of the people who live there or who did live there only return infrequently. Gina doesn't live in this house. It's her friends who live there, and she agreed to talk to visitors who wanted to learn more about Holy Cross. While I was talking to her, another couple talked to her and said that they lived in Uptown and they wanted to know how much water did these houses get here. All around the city you hear people ask, how much water did you get? How long did it sit? How much damage was there? 3 to 5 feet, but it receded, Gina explained. What's the elevation? They wanted to know. We're on high ground here, she said. It's near the river. It was the break in the Industrial Canal that brought the water. Oh, they said, We're only 5 feet above sea level in Uptown. In this contested environment, rehabilitation work is underway. What, I wonder, determines whether people think a place is safe from flooding or not? This is Kevin Mercadel. He works for the National Trust. He previously worked in affordable housing in Harlem and in the South Bronx. I talked to Kevin about this house and about the project that he's involved in. He's coordinating this effort called Home Again in the Holy Cross neighborhood. Here was the kind of preservationist that I wanted to talk to. Afterward, I wondered, what assumptions are being made about these neighborhoods? In this same way, I wanted to go to Broadmoor, a different place on the other side of town. Broadmoor is known as the bottom of the bowl. Some of you may have heard this expression that New Orleans is shaped like a bowl with water on all sides. So if New Orleans is a bowl, Broadmoor is the bottom of it, the low point. Broadmoor is a place that the Bring New Orleans Back Commission has discussed as being one that should be converted to green space. What, I wondered, was happening in this place, a mid-city neighborhood on the other side of town of mixed race and mixed income. What I found was a place that has a strong sense of community, a cohesive built environment, a mix of historic housing styles, Spanish colonial revival and other styles of the 1920s, and a strong neighborhood organization. Broadmoor residents decided to fight. They did not want to lose their homes. They do not want to lose their neighborhood, and they don't want to see it marked off the map. So they got visible, and clearly walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that part of their strategy is to make their neighborhood visible to anyone who comes near. Everywhere I went, I saw signs like this one in the neutral ground, in front lawns, at intersections. The day before I left, on this most recent trip in March, the Times-Picayune, which is the local newspaper, ran a front-page story with a map showing flood claims over the past years, and Broadmoor has had a lot of them. But the map had a caveat. It had a footnote. It said only homes that are insured are shown on this map. And as some of you know, in many areas, people are not insured, and so the map did not account for this. The map did also not account for infrastructure requirements and improvements. And the author explained that there was a big spike in flood claims in Broadmoor in the 90s, but then a decline in recent years after an infrastructure improvement. And I began to realize that often, looking at these places, there are problems in interpreting data. The data do not clearly suggest one course of action or another. And one of the things that became clear about Broadmoor was that everywhere there is risk. Everyone in New Orleans lives with risk. Pumps are everywhere. The city is interconnected, and water flows to the lowest point. And I also wondered, in reading this article, it raised the question, should flood maps assume that levees might break? And should an 80-year-old neighborhood like Broadmoor be abandoned? In my photography, I've asked a series of questions. What is happening in this place? What is the rhetoric about the condition and the future possibilities? And what is happening on the ground? For me, this is an interactive pursuit. And often when I take photographs, I don't have specific images in mind, like a photojournalist might. For me, photography is a kind of field work. And it's personal. And I thought about what I was trying to do with the camera before giving this talk, and I decided there are at least 3 things that I do when I think about photography. One is that taking photographs is a way to go places. It's a mode of engagement that's slower, it's directed, and it's on foot. Second, I use the camera to look for indicators. signs and symbols, and I use it as a way to read the built environment. And third, I'm using the camera to ask questions. Why does something look a certain way? What's happening in this place? Even in its current state, the uniqueness of New Orleans impresses strongly. New Orleans is a city of distinct neighborhoods with a close-knit historic built fabric. There's a highly uncertain political environment, and we know that stories of the place shape what we think is possible and what the future possibilities are. But New Orleans still waits. Many efforts like the one I saw underway in Holy Cross and in Broadmoor are ongoing. But having visited there in January and March, you can't escape the feeling that disaster persists all around. It's with you all the time, in the marks of the emergency crews, the reckoning after the disaster, X's on the houses, surveying the city, and at a time when nothing else works, communicating by spray paint. Thank you.
We're going to take questions after all three presentations. I neglected to say when I introduced Steve Moga that he has a website on which the images that he showed, plus many, many, many others, are up online. And that's at mogaphoto.com, which you see up there on the whiteboard. Will Stacy, our next speaker, also has a website, and you can see the images he'll be showing and many, many more on that website, willstacy.com. So you may not all be able to see it from where you're sitting, but if you want to come up later, I just wrote the websites up on the whiteboard. Will Stacy is a young photographer who's living in New York. He grew up in Philadelphia. He has only graduated from NYU in photography in the Tisch School a few years ago, and yet his images have already been published. He's becoming better and better known as a young photographer. He said to me when I invited him to be part of this lecture, actually the two of these photographers were the inspiration for this particular topic tonight, as well as Larry Vail's interest and MIT's interest in general in the rebuilding of New Orleans. But Will said to me, you know, it's as if I've been doing batting practice. When I arrived in New Orleans, it's as if I'd been doing batting practice for this assignment. Will, to put himself through college, worked as a union laborer on construction and demolition jobs in summers in college, and then he went back and photographed on these construction sites with an access that, having been a union laborer himself, gave him. He then, for his thesis at Tisch, did a study of murals in low-income neighborhoods in Philadelphia, minority neighborhoods, working with the Philadelphia Mural Project, a nonprofit organization. And his photographs not only are wonderful photographs, they're being used by that organization today. And then embarking after graduation on travels, he went and began a series of photographs of deindustrialization in towns around the country, and also before Katrina had started photographing after hurricanes along the Gulf Coast. So welcome to MIT, Will. I hope this won't be your last time, and voila.
Thank you. want to give you guys a quick introduction to my work. Like Ann said, my past projects have helped me prepare for the work that I did in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina.
The sounds we can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
You can lift the microphone just higher on your shirt.
Is this better? Is this better? In a 2-year-long project on construction, I recorded my experiences as a union laborer. And working with the Mural Arts program in Philadelphia, I was able to understand how photography can be used to not only document the efforts and achievements of a group, but also provide a gateway to envision the future, which is something that will be very important in the work that I'm doing in New Orleans. In 2004, a series of 4 hurricanes tore through Alabama and Florida, and this is what began my project After the Cry, in which I am exploring the impact hurricanes have on communities. And then this is one of the images from my project called The Ruins, Investigating the Deindustrialization of America. I arrived in New Orleans 6 weeks after the storm, and immediately realized that all of my previous work I was continuing here. I found myself exploring and continuing on many familiar ideas and themes. The destruction was absolutely unbelievable. And when I was there in October, it was really a ghost town. The only traces of life were the things left behind. And amidst this absence, I began to explore the evidence of people's life before the storm. As I wandered through the city, photographing people's neighborhoods, homes, businesses, schools, and their personal belongings, I felt accompanied by their presence, their spirit. And this spirit, this presence, was something that was very important to me in this project, and ultimately is what I felt guided me to my subjects, and led me to what I photographed. One of the few people that I did encounter was Esther Blackman. And the following photographs were taken on Mrs. Blackman's first visit to her home after the storm. She was there to recover what she could and to really just take it all in. She had to stop at times to cry, and for the most part she seemed really shaken, tired, and withdrawn. As she stared off into thought, pondering the future, I saw in her eyes that she knew there was more to come, and that the battle had only just begun. And this is a photograph of her daughter. She's a strong woman, and I think she's going to be prepared for the long road ahead in dealing with the recovery and rebuilding her life. when I returned home to New York and began working with these series of images, I began contacting Katrina survivors and collecting their stories. And these stories that people were sharing with me were so powerful that I ultimately was moved to shift my focus and start investigating these people and their stories. And as I continue my work, I plan to create a narrative by combining my images and their writing. The stories, memories, reflections that I've collected describe these unbelievable stories of escape, survival, their reflections on how life has changed after the storm, and what they're doing now, and how they're rebuilding their lives. And I see these voices, these stories, as they stand next to my images, as a way to carry my viewer, guide my viewer through this place, through my photographs, just as these people's presence guided me as I explored this place. And I want to share a story with you that Renee Lewis has shared with me. We have yet to get a FEMA trailer. We have been evicted from the hotel that we were in Florida. The contractor that we hired to fix my mother's house has stolen the few items that we were able to salvage, which has totally crushed her. We're fighting daily battles with our insurance company, mortgage company, FEMA, etc., which has me in a complete mental wreck. We have not yet received any insurance money to fix our property. It's 7 months after the storm, for God's sakes. Nothing seems to be getting better. In fact, it seems to be getting increasingly worse. Stress is killing us all. We lost my dad right after the hurricane. He had a heart attack and dropped dead. He never had heart problems in his life. We had to have a mock funeral because there was nowhere to bury him. He was cremated. Stress is killing us all. While I know that there are a lot of people with different stories, everyone is going through their own personal hell. I don't think that anyone who has not actually been here, seen it, smelled it, or lived it could understand. Photographing what remains of the past has allowed me to understand the present. And as the storm has left its mark, changed lives, I'm interested in what changes will take place in the future. As I continue to work in New Orleans, I want to document these moments of change. I am in the midst of planning to work with a community group and document its efforts in shaping the future of New Orleans, its planning, its rebuilding. And working with that group, I want to explore the individual stories that exist within a larger context of a group effort. These individuals' efforts must be seen and heard. And I'm not just interested in my photographs as a document. I see them as a contribution to the rebuilding of New Orleans, as a tool for envisioning the future of the city. By recording the visible, tangible marks of change, such as the progression of the efforts that individuals are making, the marks that can be seen from man's doings, and working in areas and rebuilding them. I will be documenting this, but on At the same time, they will be revealing the invisible, the things that you can't see, such as the energy, the dedication and spirit and beauty of these efforts and these people that exist in the everyday and the ordinary. I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but I'm more passionate and consumed by this project than any other work I've done to date. I know I must return, and I don't know how long I'm going to be working on this project, but these stories and experiences must be heard, and I'm connected to this work and this project in so many ways. I'm convinced that there's a contribution to be made through photography in the rebuilding and planning of the future of the city, and I'm looking for ways to do so. I'm determined to seek a dialogue in helping to rebuild New Orleans. I just wanted to close with these series of images as we think about the future. Can you guys read that?
Read it for us.
Ideas and leadership will shape our future. We will prosper or decline based on who we choose to lead. And then a list of politicians. And it's these moments of transition really must be preserved and understood as they are our gateway into the future. That's it. And you want me to get your thing?
I hope that these two young photographers have so on track that we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and I hope that they're having chosen these few images have just whet your appetite to go to their websites and see more. And I don't know if you all felt, I felt like I wanted to see more and more and more as they showed them. So Larry Vail will be speaking next, and he has a few photographs to show himself. So they're just getting that up and
Well, I had the... Is this thing working okay? No. Okay? Any better? I don't know if it's doing... Yeah, that sounds better. Anyway, I had the pleasure to spend an afternoon with Steve Moga photographing at the end of March in the New Orleans East neighborhood. And I think, as you can see here, how important it is, literally and figuratively, to have people like Steve and Will, go see what's on the other side of the tracks, and to show us in the, I think, great tradition of photography going back at least to Jacob Riis, something about how other people are living at a time of great distress. This is actually looking at a pumping station outfall in New Orleans East that was there. But one of the things that Anne asked me to do in a simple email was step back and reflect on the potential role of photography in rebuilding New Orleans and more generally in planning. So what I wanted to try and do is assess a little bit about the feeling that I have from the work that the others have shown tonight, but to also try and convey through some of the images that that I took a few days ago, some of the principles that I think may underline not only what their photographs show, but what I was trying to do as well. But more, if I'm to take that charge of being a bit more reflective, it came into full focus on Friday morning when I was on a panel with Governor Blanco in New York. And she said, in introducing her remarks, the following. She described New Orleans as the first American city to be erased and forced to redesign itself. And I think, first of all, she got the verb wrong. It was not erased, as you have clearly seen tonight. And second, she had the protagonist wrong. Cities are not capable of designing or redesigning themselves. It's about people, it's about communities, it's about interpretation, it's about the role of designers and community groups, and the role of artists and others who are going to shape that kind of material. And I can't tell you how many times I heard people refer to this city as a blank slate. Someone else on the same panel that was with me who should know better, who's visited the place, is describing these kinds of places. So the first thing that's very clear to me is that the role of photography in New Orleans and more generally in planning has to be to bear witness and to remind people that most neighborhoods have not been erased by the storm. They've been merely rendered more vulnerable to subsequent human action. The legacy of the modernist tabula rasa is still with us in this kind of thinking. The arrogance of mid-century planning and design, these kinds of things are very, very clear. But what photography is doing is both interpreting and documenting cultural landscapes. It's forcing planners and other citizens to come to grips with the deepest human dimensions of inhabited places. Even if they're destroyed and abandoned, they're inhabited in very fundamental ways. There are rights and responsibilities that we can see still visible in the piles of recombinant debris that we've seen tonight. There are property lines, there are family ties, there are local businesses, there are remnants of human lives that have been upended but may nonetheless end up reconstituted. And this is the kind of message that I think we have to be able to look at as we see some of these things. So one of the challenges that I think came across in the work that we've seen tonight was how does the photographer manage to convey the intimacy of these scenes without violating privacy? And for me, the relief I had when I first looked at Will's website was the kind of pairing of the dialogue with people with the images. I still find that the image of Mrs. Blackman's first visit, where she's hanging on her defoliated tree, to be a way of legitimizing the role of photography by the conversation that is happening. Sometimes that's a conversation that is literally words exchanged between person and person, human and human. Sometimes it's a more metaphoric dialogue that the camera is asking the viewer to do. But it's a kind of storytelling that provides a right of entry into a disrupted world that I think gives the moral credibility to this kind of work and makes it seem less intrusive than it might. The thing that I find so remarkable about the photographs that we've seen from Steve and from Will and from others in this area is the extent to which the utterly conventional in cities is made extraordinary by the forced deviation from normalcy. There's this rearrangement of the everyday that we see as we look through New Orleans and places. It's familiarity, but there are key pieces missing. That we share as viewers a sense of the vocabulary of the complete thing, so that we can see the absences, we can know the extent of the missing gap that's there. We know what's been made crooked, whether it's the one-way sign that we saw in one of Steve's photos or something else. These are photos about control and loss of control. There are these partial inversions of convention that just permeate the kind of process of photography post-disaster, especially in New Orleans. There are violations of boundaries all over the place. It's indoor and outdoor. How are those transformed from what we conventionally think of? You know, what does it mean when the house doesn't have a window, when the door is open? Public and private. It's transformed, past and present. Horizontal and vertical, things that we take for granted as pedestrians. Strength and weakness. Permanent, ephemeral. Abandonment and return. Despair and faith. So as I was trying to make some sense of this, I wanted to look at three kinds of ways that I think photography may speak to us. The first is literally. There is a process of denotation. There's a sense that sometimes the words in the image, neighbors, let me gut your house, Katrina sucks, walkers were here, 9/14/05. These kinds of things that are there, in this case in New Orleans East. Or here in Plaquemine Parish, where I spent an afternoon with Lee Graham, it says, God will give back more on the slide. These kinds of messages that people are making out there for others to come by. Katrina was big, but God is bigger. Here we're in Mississippi, where most of my images that will follow are from. This is the town of Waveland, if ever there was a place more aptly named for the juxtaposition of sea and land that occurred when the center of the hurricane passed through 7 months exactly before this photograph was taken. It would be Waveland, Mississippi, or Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, where the sign ironically says, do not remove steeple. Who are they talking to? Presumably it's simply those who would clean up the debris and not recognize what this is. But it's a piece of a missing juxtaposed puzzle that is just simply in the wrong place. Some people in Mississippi seem to have managed a bit of humor by time. Here we are a block away from the Gulf of Mexico in a neighborhood that was completely wiped to the floor slab by the force of the storm surge in a place that had existed for many decades without ever having a direct hit from a hurricane. Another one, Who'da Thunk, just another manic Monday, and then the name of the family that was there. These messages that are out there, the literal way that's there. But photography is doing something, I think, even more powerful and more intrinsic with the aesthetics of the metaphor. And it's something that we saw, I think, in a lot of the work of the first two. And that's taking things that are normally properties of the photograph and emphasizing them. In one case, what might be called exemplification, drawing attention to certain things more than others. So the symmetry of places, like the sand-covered path leading up to this church that now exists as a temporary building that is, of course, the first and really only thing to come back here in Waveland, Mississippi. Or the power of the symmetry of the entryway that seems to have survived completely intact, even though the house behind it is nowhere to be seen. This kind of thing, where we read in the conventions aesthetics to see everything there except the missing central piece beyond the fountain, which must have been some large house and not an electrical truck or a trailer or a strewn car in the back. These kinds of patterns of symmetry that were there, or things that we associate with the pattern of houses that belong on lots centered on their lots. There's a convention there of houses, and when something is just a kilter, like this one, where the middle house here in New Orleans East is simply not where it's supposed to be, it becomes a way of understanding the disruption. Or if we looked at that same church in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, here it's emphasizing the fact that the piece is horizontal instead of vertical on the church. This thing that looks even too large to have ever fit on the top of that building. May have been that was part of the problem. Or this kind of unintentionally ironic sign of open house, or the fact that it becomes impossible for me to look at azaleas blooming again in quite the same way when I see the foundation plantings and a piece of the foundation and no house that's there. That somehow the plantings were more able to withstand the power of the storm surge than the entire house that would have been behind it. What was this open house that was planned for 7 months and 1 day before? Who knows? Or images like this, where you have the recombinant remnants of a barbershop in New Orleans East, inside versus outside, signage that doesn't quite communicate, the kinds of things that are drawing attention to a symmetrical building, but no longer really part of the place because the chairs and everything else are simply piled. When Steve and I visited this area, a little strip mall in New Orleans East, it was as if no one had touched a thing in 7 months. It really was quite remarkable. All of the recombinant debris of each business just laid out there in juxtaposition in the sand, in the sun, in the dirt, waiting. Delicious takeouts. All that they had to take out from this place looked less delicious by the time here in a place near the central business district of New Orleans. And then in addition to these kinds of blown symmetries and aesthetic conventions that are upended by photographs of disaster, and in addition to the other mode of denotation and literal kinds of images, there's a third way that I think these photographs speak to us, and it really has to do with kinds of metaphors that we bring to it. Another image here, again from New Orleans East, where one sees these kinds of messages of rearranged faith and patriotism. I'm not sure whether Protection 1, as the sign says, refers to the flag or the Madonna or whoever. I'm not too good on my Catholic imagery, but the message of people trying to assert themselves after the hurricane, commenting on the nature of their house, even as the water line still remains between the cross and the flag. Those sorts of things. Or the other view outward from that church in Waveland that's there on the temporary thing, where you're left with just the last little bits of brick and the figures staring out at the ocean that didn't stop. And then there are chairs that are lined up not like the ones we just saw in Will's photograph that still had their debris there from the meeting that preceded the hurricane. They're the chairs that are lined up around a table from people that have come back to their floor slab, that are trying to engage with the new post-Katrina life a block away from the Gulf of Mexico that had engulfed their home, but not completely stopped everything else that they cared about. The flag on the slab is a metaphor for the kind of faith and patriotism that is there in the kinds of parts of small-town Mississippi that I was going to on that day. And then lastly, an image that I think, again, stood out to me in particular. This is a house in New Orleans East where a high school diploma has been stuffed inside the grating of an abandoned home. And what it says to me is, first of all, someone knows the person who lived in this place. Someone is back wondering about them, trying to be helpful, trying to be involved in the way that they can. And what it seems to me implied in photographing this is that there is an invitation to dialogue. There's an invitation to tell the story and imagine the story that might be there, even if you can't find Mrs. Blackman and you can't find the people that are there in that place that you'd want to work with. And so that, to me, is the value of photography in these kinds of settings. They're correctives to false generalizations that demean the nature of an inhabited place, and they are invitations to dialogue, to ask better questions, and to see what can be done to help other people provide better answers. Thank you.
Hello?
Questions?
I guess the question for anyone that was looking at siege decorators in particular, you focused on pretty devastated areas, and I wondered if there were, in the areas that you hear about that are still inhabited, the French Quarter where tourists are coming back and so forth, were there visual disjunctures that you saw in places like that that you could have photographed that would have shown you that something was awry, or did visually just kind of look deceptively normal?
Am I on, or should I talk? All right, that's better. I like that anyway. It's my high school debate training skills. All right, let's try again. We don't want the web to miss out on this exciting response. How's that? No?
I don't think we're on.
How's that? Yes? No? Okay. It was hard, it was really hard to choose what images to show tonight. You know, I knew I had about 20 minutes, so I picked specific things to show. So that's part of the answer to your question. Sort of like Larry was saying, there's this inversion. Some things are normal and some things are not. So even in the quarter or in Uptown, you'll see blue tarps on roofs. You'll see the effects of 300,000 people missing. You know, you take 300,000 people away from a city, and there's, you know, problems in labor supply. There's problems getting people to, you know, just have the basic services of the city working. So the kinds of pictures I took in the quarter were limited restaurant hours, help wanted signs. You see more men with guns than you would have before. I think less so than 6 months ago, but you still see a lot of private security services. I saw guys with State Farm shirts on, you know, it's stuff that you wouldn't, or you notice it different, it changes your perception. So even in the areas that we hear about as sort of returning to normal, nothing is normal, everything's changed.
Well, I think we were there at different times. When I was there, it was incredible. It was an incredibly surreal experience in the sense that most areas were completely deserted. When I was there, the lower 9th Ward was guarded by, I guess the National Guard had come in and wasn't allowing people in. But that was really it. Here and there, you would come across someone who was returning to their home. And even the places that didn't look so devastated were still abandoned when I was there. I assume that they turned over time. I haven't been back since October.
No comment. I was, well, I had some random thoughts, a couple of comments. The only other flood is Larry knows, and I know a lot about is the Johnstown flood in 1889. And I did a huge amount of reading on it, and they call it the book. And one of the interesting things about that experience, which totally destroyed a city of about 60,000 people in 20 minutes, was what happened afterwards. And I just wonder what the difference is. But actually what they did was they began to clear away the debris, and then they went around and celebrated each flood surviving building. In the city, this is thousands, even though the city was destroyed, there were still 1,000 buildings or something. And if you go there today, they have these incredible plaques from 1889 that this building survived the flood. You can imagine what buildings were a disaster. Worse than this, because the water was 35 or 40 feet high. And having gotten into New Orleans, I'm sort of puzzled by the melancholy of it all. Is it just the scale, or do you think we've lost something about the ability to go back and rebuild, about the desire to do this? It just seems to be an incredible photographs. Envie about this whole thing. Is it worth it? Or not. And another comment that I have is it seems almost, photographs are beautiful, really, so don't ignore them. It seems almost too easy to be photographing the destruction. Because I think everywhere I put my camera, I'm going to get a good photograph, right? Or I'm going to get a pathetic photograph, not as beautiful as the ones you have. Is there a way of recording, and some of your photographs did, I think, Larry, the survival, the rebirth, the celebration of, kind of return of life? Is there a way of, some of your photographs did, but I thought you might want to comment on that. It seems more difficult to get through or get at. So just a little disconnected thoughts, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I was there in October, so obviously it was very desolate. But as I return, it's this time, these moments of the in-between, these transitional moments, as the end of the past, this old city, its spirit kind of fades out, and the birth of the new begins. It's the handoff. It's this moment and where we are right now is incredibly important to me, and my work, and things that I want to investigate. And ultimately, it's what I have as a long ongoing project. What I feel I have now is kind of chapter 1, after the storm, and it's where I'm going and where the city goes. What happens will be told, and it's we'll see. but it's something that is amidst change.
Yeah, I have a lot of things I would say about that. I think there is an aspect to which it is easy, but I think that there's also the dilemma that Larry described in terms of what's inside is now outside and what's outside is now inside. And so there's a lot of stuff around to photograph, but there's a constant question in my mind, is this the right thing to be photographing? What story does this tell? Why am I doing this? You know, are these scenes of devastation a call to action, like I would like them to be, or are they a call to inaction, as you suggested? That would be the opposite meaning, you know? And this is the problem with imagery, I think, and with captioning, talking about photographs, trying to put something on the web, the way photojournalists tell their story, you know, in the newspaper. So there's lots of efforts to tell a story there. You know, if you look in the pages of the Times-Picayune, or if you read any major national paper, they're reporting on things that are happening in New Orleans all the time. And there are efforts to shape the impressions of Americans about what should be done there. It's impossible to tell all of those stories in, you know, one short presentation or even in one newspaper article. But I think I feel at least a responsibility to my own sense of what I've observed. And to me, it's shocking and it's shameful that our country has not done more for a great American city. And that's the message. If I, you know, had a message to deliver, that's the message that I would say.
I actually wanted to comment also, if I could, to your thoughts, because I think while the destruction is relatively easy to photograph, I think one of the interesting things about being there regularly is that you cease to see it. You know, after a while, like I'm there a lot. And you get very used. I mean, every time that you go into the lower ninth, you say, "Oh, it looks like this." But if you drive down Claiborne Avenue, and the same places are still closed up and burned out from the storm, you sort of stop noticing them because you're going back and forth by them every day. I think the idea of the melancholy comes from this. There's this total fear down there of complete disinvestment and abandonment, and it feels really isolated down there in terms of once you get down on the ground. This is not a wealthy city, this is not a wealthy state. Who's going to help us? We're doing our best to save ourselves, but we need assistance, and there's a real risk that we're not going to get it. And the third thing about the survival, I think Larry and I saw a whole bunch of houses that were a complete wreck in Clackamas Parish, but all the families had been back, and so they were saying, don't bulldoze, I'm keeping. And so there was like this real sort of sense of life attached to these houses, even though you couldn't see the people attached to them. All of the houses had these messages, and it was almost like they were sort of communicating with you. So you felt sort of like life was going on, even though you weren't quite sure what was going to happen to the actual structures.
I have a half-baked thought, so forgive me if it seems a little disconnected, but it begins with two images that I think that Will showed. And the images were the bank's open doors that you showed at the end, looking out into a bright, undistinguishable area. And there was one that was in a room that looked as though it was filled with sand, and the water had rushed back out the window, taking some of the sand back out with it. Am I right? That was one of yours as well. And it struck me that those two slides struck me to be of a type of photo that we haven't seen. And that started me categorizing the photos that we've seen, both in the newspaper and what we saw this evening. And let me give it a try. We saw photographs and TV images of the storm coming in. And in your photos, we see a little bit of evidence of that, but of course we don't see what that was like really. We see trucks up on end and cars, and you can sort of imagine that. Then we saw images of floodwaters filling streets, evacuations happening, people congregating on bridges. That was another type of image that we saw. What we didn't see in the media, but what we saw tonight, were pictures of what happened when the water receded, which was another type of action in the environment, so to speak. And then I would take one of Larry's pictures. You had the barbershop picture, right? And the barbershop picture is very interesting because that is an example of what happened when people came back and removed things from the buildings, which is sort of the next step after the water had removed things from the building. So there's another type of image, and the steeple is a little bit like that. Right? I can't imagine that the steeple fell in that place. There was the hands of someone who moved it to that position for some reason, to get it on the street, and then there's another category, which is another wave, which is the wave of things moving back. Sort of exemplified for me by the table that was set up with the chairs around it on the flat set slab, but you all showed images that might fall into the category as well. And it struck me that bringing those types of damage, other types of damage, removal types of damage, and those types of responses to the public is really the role that the three of you and others have to play. Because the images that most of us have seen are in the first two categories. Right? So, it's not a question, it's just a response to what I think I saw.
Photography is document process. Which you wouldn't
Well,
get
I don't
unless
think
you
I'm quite saying that, but I haven't thought about it carefully enough to name it.
But there's another part of the story that struck me when I was down there. We were down there on the same day, didn't know that we were actually in the Ninth Ward on the same day. But I was with the Army Corps, and they were talking about various things that had happened. And the thing that isn't visible now, but I'm wondering if a year or two from now, we saw all those beautiful openings lining the streets. Supposedly, very few of those may be surviving because they came along to scoop up the debris, and those live oaks have very, very shallow roots. And so they probably have damaged a lot of those live oak trees. And some, we saw some of just these huge trees that were just part of the storm. So this is a case of after damage, by cleaning up debris, they are getting damaged that. And then the thing with one of our, I don't think Earthia is here, but the looking at the toxic substance there in which of these neighborhoods, if you go back in 2 years, are going to be starting and starting to suffer from some of the toxic materials that are around. And one person I met, one of the many people I met, said that she doesn't want to let her dog out in the backyard because she's afraid that the dog will pick up toxic material, like paws and so on. So there are these hidden things that it's very difficult to pick up in photography today, but maybe over time we can document.
Well, I think the important thing that both of you talked about was that you're photographing processes. You're not photographing a condition only at one moment in time. They both have said that they feel this commitment to go back over time to get connected somehow with people who are engaged together in the rebuilding. And as Will said, it's chapter 1. As Steve said, he's already been back once. Will is making plans to go back again and to get engaged with people and communities who are working. And it seems to me that that's what goes beyond photojournalism, which may be the photographer may be going in and has an assignment and a shooting script and goes in and takes that photograph, then runs with the story. Whereas
there's an investigation. Do you want to comment on that?
I think it's also, we both talked that this is something that is taking over us. It's something that we are attached to and is in our hearts, and ultimately is in our everything. This is a huge, long story that, you know, I don't think America really understands for the most part as a result of the media of what's really happening. The stories that I've been collecting and talking to people of what their daily lives are right now, America really kind of has no clue of what the hardships and what conditions exist. When I was there, you know, you talked about the damage that's, you know, in the ground and whatnot. In a neighborhood in St. Bernard Parish, which is near Murphy Oil, I spoke to a woman who said the oil was up to the windows and the water was up to the roofs. And they don't know if anyone in that neighborhood will return because of the oil damage in the areas, in the ground. But this is something that isn't, you know, just kind of we did and are moving on to the next. It's something that was begun and the ordinance of continuing.
Yeah, I have a question more about how this is affecting you personally as a photographer, looking at such incredible images. And, you know, a lot of them, to me, are really searing. Just looking at them, I was just wondering how it sort of affects you in your day-to-day life, carrying this material in your head.
Well, when I got back from New Orleans, and I was kind of messed up for a month. I was completely withdrawn. It really took me a while to get back and readjusted to normal life. Buildings that were intact, people on this, you know, New York is obviously a lot different than an abandoned New Orleans. And even just reconnecting with people was really difficult for me. It was something that left me emotionally and physically exhausted. I really needed a month of just to recover from it as I worked with, you know, and as soon as I got back, I was working with these images. So I was reliving those experiences, what I saw, what the stories I heard. I mean, I gave a lecture a little while ago, and I read a different story. You know, I had to hold back tears, like in the middle of this lecture. And it's that profound personal connection that, you know, I have no control over it anymore. It's something that I'm doing and obsessed with, and exploring what will become of the future.
Right. No, I find it interesting myself how sometimes putting a camera between you and what you look like sort of abstracts it. Sometimes depersonalizes the experience where it's a conflict because, in a sense, intellectually, you know what you're really looking at and the trauma that other people have suffered as a result of that.
But it also brings you closer. The camera is for me, brings me closer. It's how I connect with my subject. It's how I feel. It's you know, it's the everyday that, you know, you can kind of become numb to things. But it's the camera that is, for me, an act of passion and love, and it's the seeing, the exploring, that really connects me to my subject. For me, you know, everyone's different.
How is it for you, Larry? Looking at it?
I went to Mississippi on the last day of my trip, and I missed my plane. So let me leave it at that.
Well, there's a lot of different feelings about it. First is that I really love the city. I was there 4 times before the flood, the hurricane and the flood. So for me, being in that place, even seeing what's happened to it, there are still parts of what makes it such a great American city, such a unique American city. So having access to that in a way is like a antidote,
Right.
you know,
Right.
because it also is traumatic, and I struggled with it too, you know, and my friend who lives there is a good check for me, because, you know, New Orleanians have, and we saw it in some of the signs and some of the comments that people made, the places. They have a sense of humor, you know. They have a sense of the way they think people live. They have a lot of pride in their city. And so, at the same time, they have to live with it, you know. And I get to come back here. So, every time I talk to my friend, or to her friends, or her neighbors, or other people that we meet, something else sort of gives me a new perspective, you know. So I'm highly conscious of being a visitor to this environment, you know, or trying to interpret it, or being an outsider, not being a New Orleanian. And for me, the challenge then, and Larry stated it as a sort of moral challenge, you know, in taking what kinds of images you take, and I do think it is a moral challenge, is what to do with these kinds of photographs. You know, they have a lot of personal meaning for me, but how they're displayed or how to talk about them was a challenge. So this is, you know, a first attempt. So maybe a year from now, you know, we'll have an update on what's happening in New Orleans or something like that. But it's incredibly challenging, personally challenging subject matter. You're right.
I can't imagine another question after those answers, so thank you.